now we're going to look at the last topic for this unit in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict. For this unit, we're just looking at the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict and how Israel was created into a nation with the ensuing 1948 Arab-Israeli War. So we'll be finishing today with looking at the aftermath of that war. In the next unit that we do in class, we'll be then picking up the Arab-Israeli conflict again with a crisis that happened in 1956 called the Suez Crisis. But this is where we're finishing up for today. So if you look at page 113 up to 118, you can see where this topic is located. It's basically the aftermath of the war in terms of how it left Israel and the Arab states. It discusses a lot about the condition of Palestinian refugees now, which before we've been talking about the Jewish refugees who had to leave after the diaspora. It's kind of an opposite of that situation now. You can also see quite a few photographs in these pages highlighting the problem of these Palestinian refugees. So let's take a look at now this reverse situation, the Palestinian Diaspora. We talked about the Jewish diaspora before, which occurred during the time of the Roman Empire when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70 and the Jews were then dispersed and no longer allowed to live in Palestine. The same thing happened now after the end of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. If you look back at page 111, you can see the map of what Israel looked like after the war was over. And you notice that there is no Arab state. Israel took more land than what it was going to be given by the UN partition plan, and therefore they represented about 75% of Palestine now. The Palestinian Arabs who had lived there were now faced with a couple of choices. They could leave Palestine altogether and try to go into a neighboring Arab state, or they could try to locate themselves into an area of Palestine that was under the control of other Arab nations. If you look at that map again, you can see that Egypt was given a section of land, which was known as the Gaza Strip, still known that today. Jordan was given a section of land on Palestine's eastern side, and this was going to be called the West Bank, because it's the West Bank of Jordan. And then finally there were some other areas on the borders of these other Arab countries where there were refugee camps located. So if you look at the statistics on the screen here, by June of 1949, which was about 6 months after the armistice was signed between Israel and the Palestinian Arabs, approximately 1 million Palestinian Arabs had left by that point. And that meant that there were approximately 130,000 up to 150,000 Palestinian Arabs who remained inside of what was now Israel. And so you can imagine for those people that chose to remain that the situation was very tense, and obviously these people would be in fear of violence and terrorist attacks because of the fact that Israel now dominated Palestine. So again, you can see these locations where these Palestinian Arabs remained, if they chose to remain in Israel, these sections which were under the control of these Arab countries, but technically within the borders of Palestine. So a very tense situation. This is one of the biggest issues of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is still the heart of the conflict today. The reasons why these refugees left Palestine, obviously, if given the choice, with Israel being successful in the war and victorious, most Palestinian Arabs would probably not want to live in Israel, being that it was now Jewish dominated. But the problem was this, if you see on the screen, if these refugees left voluntarily and chose to go into another Arab state, such as Egypt, then the Jews could say that they had no right of return and they would be legally correct in doing so. However, if the refugees were forced out, then Israel would have the responsibility to care for them and promise to return them at a later point, which we can imagine that Israel would not want that responsibility at all. So here's where the Israelis and the Arabs differ as to what actually happened in the war itself and afterwards. The Israelis say that the Arab armies that were made up of the countries surrounding Palestine encouraged Palestinian refugees to leave Palestine and to go into other Arab countries. And therefore, if they were being encouraged, that means that the Palestinian Arabs were voluntarily leaving, which meant that they would not be allowed to return if the Jews chose not to allow them. So that's, of course, the story that the Israelis were spreading. However, the Arabs would obviously say the opposite. They would say that Israel was systematically forcing these refugees out, which meant it was forcibly, and that the Jews were using terrorist actions and violence, which had definitely occurred during the war, we know that. The Arabs referenced those different massacres that were brought up in the last recording, like the one on page 110, the Deir Yassin, which was an Arab settlement where women and children were killed. And so the Arabs used that as evidence that the Israelis were systematically trying to force Palestinian Arabs out of Palestine. So two different stories here as far as which one is correct. Probably it's a little bit of both. And therefore the refugee problem is still an ongoing situation today. The UN did step in and try to address the situation as it was occurring immediately after the 1948 war. They first set up this organization that you see right here, the Palestine Conciliation Commission, and what they were trying to do is reach some type of an agreement on what actually was going to be done with these refugees, so when they would be allowed back in or where they would go from that point, and that question still has not been resolved. And then additionally, the UN set up this organization right here, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, or UNRWA, and this still is in existence as well. If you look at page 115, you can see a sidebar about the organization and the fact that they're only representing those refugees that were affected by the 1948 war or their descendants. So other refugees from other later Arab-Israeli wars are not represented by this UN agency today. So this refugee problem has produced a lot of violence over the course of the years after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Palestinian Arabs refer to it as al-Nakba, which means the catastrophe, and it's still a very touchy issue today. These photographs that you see, there's one on 113, 115, and 116, you can see the conditions that these refugees were facing now. So in any situation, a refugee problem is not good, especially this one, given the height of the tensions that were already at work here. Now let's turn our attention to how this war affected the newly formed State of Israel and how it also affected the bordering Arab states, which obviously were very upset at the outcome. For Israel, they now formed themselves an official government. And in that, it was based on proportional representation. There were about 20 different political parties, and each would receive a proportionate amount of seats in their legislative body, which was called the Knesset. It would be similar to our Congress, or in Great Britain, the Parliament. It's basically the body that creates the laws for the state. David Ben-Gurion, he was from the major party of the Knesset, which you can see on 115 was called the Mapai Party. It was a left-wing party, and that makes sense given that David Ben-Gurion, before Israel was made a state, was more of the radical type of approach, wanting total change and wanting any action necessary to create Israel into a legit country. So because he was from the major party that was represented in the Knesset, as far as those who received votes, he became Israel's first prime minister. You can also see another individual that we've seen in these pages, Chaim Weizmann. He was the one during the years of World War II who was more in favor of a gradualist approach into creating the State of Israel. However, he was very influential in this whole process. I had mentioned before that he was the individual who had helped to lobby for the Balfour Declaration during the years of World War I because of his success in development of acetone for the weaponry, and he used that as a bargaining tool to get the British government to issue the Balfour Declaration. So he's obviously been a very important person, and even though he disagreed with David Ben-Gurion's approach, he was still given this ceremonial position of president. He was very old at this point, but a very well-respected person among the Jewish community. One thing that's interesting to note is that there was not a constitution developed at this point in Israel's history, and there's several reasons for that. Because of the conditions being what they were, very tense still, and Israel was still in its infancy. It was in a fragile state, and it was seen that a constitution might upset certain groups within Israel, like certain political parties or individuals, and produce tension that they didn't need at that point, given that they had just emerged from a war. And another reason for the constitution not being created at this point was because if you have a constitution, then you have to define certain things, like territorial boundaries, and this was something that was still up in the air, even though the Israelis were victorious in conquering more land than what they were given by the UN, and they were occupying those lands. It wasn't officially recognized borders by the world community. And that was something that would be established if there was a constitution written. And David Ben-Gurion kind of thought that it would be best to kind of leave that discussion for a later time. So a constitution was not developed at first. However, there were laws issued to govern the people. And one of those is significant. It was called the Law of Return. And this was basically to encourage Jews around the world to come to Israel, that there would be a place for them. And so basically it was going back to the Jewish diaspora in Roman times. It was a call for all of those people who had been forcibly removed from Palestine in AD 70 to now return to Israel in 1948. So again, I want to emphasize that Israel is the only ancient group of people to re-emerge in modern times in their original homelands. And now they're welcoming all those back from 2,000 years ago to come back into these boundaries. Another thing that's interesting, if you look back, there's a student study section question, which I think is a really interesting question, and it's on page 110. The Israelis, in their official proclamation of becoming a state, use the term Eretz Israel, which basically means that it's Israel in the boundaries that they claimed under the promise of Isaac. So it's not what the UN wanted to give them, nor even what they conquered in the 1948 war. It was the boundaries set by God in the promise given to Isaac for the land of Canaan, the ancient promised land. So you can obviously tell that they feel very passionate that this is their land, that they're going to now continue to work for its completion of the borders they feel that they're deserved to. So the population definitely grew in these short years, in 1949 to 1952. It doubled to 1.4 million, so it was definitely growing in numbers. And there were basically two main groups that came into Israel at this time. European Jews, which it's easy to imagine why they would want to come in, given the conditions after World War II. But also other Middle Eastern or Asian Jews returned to Israel as well. And what ended up happening was the European Jews sort of felt that they were in a way superior to the other Jews, and there was almost like a two-class society that emerged, which you can see here. It's mentioned on page 116. Ben-Gurion, the new prime minister, was more in favor of the European Jews, and because of that, there was definitely some political discord. And the two main parties that developed because of this, the Mapai was already in existence, as well as this right-wing party, the Likud. However, they both took positions indirectly on which group of Jews they tended to favor in society, whether it was the European Jews or the Middle Eastern Asian Jews. The European Jews tended to have more job skills and social background than the Middle Eastern or Asian Jews, who had little skills and therefore lived in lower class settlements and camps because they didn't have the skills to initially succeed in society. So definitely there was some social issues at work here as Israel developed. And you can see finally for Israel that they had some problems that they had to address. Even though they gained more land than what was given to them by the UN, they still faced issues with the shortage of water and food supplies. Palestine itself is a small area. It's about, like I had mentioned before, the size of New Jersey. And even though there are natural resources there, because of the size of it, it's not extensive, especially for a growing population that you see here. They didn't possess a whole lot of natural resources of their own. They had imported oil from other Arab states prior to this, and now, of course, the Arab states don't want to have anything to do with them. So they had to reach out to other sources, obviously the United States, because of this relationship that has existed between them now. But even that became a source that wasn't really reliable after the war. It was seen by these American organizations that the Jews could kind of stand on their own feet. Ironically, another foreign aid source came from Germany, which seems very ironic, but the new president of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, after they had succeeded in getting on their feet with help from the Marshall Plan, issued a reparations agreement, or reparations treaty, which was to compensate Holocaust survivors and their descendants, who are now, many of them, living in Israel. So that became a major source of aid, which helped Israel develop financially, to develop industry and agriculture, which they became very successful with. So that's really ironic that that's the source of aid that they received. Finally, for the Arab states, the major problem was humiliation, and how were they going to deal with what they felt was a huge injustice with being defeated, and now the question of all these refugees. In many of the Arab countries bordering Palestine, there was a lot of political turmoil. You can see that there were military coups and assassinations in the countries of Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, but most significantly in Egypt, who was still trying to become independent from the British and were trying to break free. an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, which actually had existence since the 1920s, were able to stage an uprising which led to the final removal of Britain as a governing power and the removal of their king, and a new person by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who would be very influential in the Arab-Israeli relationship from this point on. So terrorist groups, organizations that we think of like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, were all the result of these Arab states feeling very unjustly treated in this war in 1948.